Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasper Boers, and I'm the events director of the Buckley program. I'd like to welcome all of you to our event today. We also welcome Dr. Hayward back to campus for the fourth lecture of his visiting series this semester on conservative philosophy. This lecture being titled An Elephant and Its Trump, Thoughts on Conservatism and Populism, a topic I'm sure we've all been wondering about in recent years. So firstly, for those of you who don't know, the Buckley program is an organization dedicated to increasing intellectual diversity and free speech on campus. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and conferences. By becoming a Buckley Fellow, you have access to an array of fellow-only events, such as private meals with our guests, complimentary attendance at our events, and of course, the highly anticipated disinvitation dinner each April, which this year will be held in honor of Dr. Henry Kissinger. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. And fellows, if you wouldn't mind signing in at the card swiper we have up front, that would be great. So now on to Dr. Hayward. Stephen Hayward is currently a senior resident scholar at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of Government. Dr. Hayward has written books on topics such as the environment and President Ronald Reagan, and is a noted expert on the Reagan years in America. His writings have been featured in many prominent publications ranging from the National Review to the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal. We're very excited to have Dr. Hayward with us today to share his thoughts and expertise. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hayward.
Well, thank you, Jasper. And I have to say, I am myself really looking forward to the disinvitation dinner next month with Henry Kissinger. And I got to thinking, what a perfect person to invite, because he hasn't just been disinvited from college campuses, he's been disinvited from entire countries, right? He's been threatened with arrest if he goes to, I forget where, Chile or Indonesia or something. But that's quite an accomplishment when not just a college campus, but an entire continent or subcontinent will say you're disinvited. As mentioned, I chose my title for tonight, An Elephant and Its Trump, mostly because I thought it just sounded fun. But then the subtitle, Populism, Nationalism, and Conservatism, is really what I want to talk about. I don't really want to talk about Trump directly much at all, because I think he's, what's the right word? He's a symptom of some larger trends going on here in this country and around the world in many ways. And also, I don't know about you. I mean, we've got a long way to go yet with him, whether he's reelected or not. Trump years are like dog years. It's amazing how much is packed into. It's only Tuesday, and it's only been a couple, 48 hours since the Mueller report was summarized, and all kinds of things happen. I do get weary of it from time to time. It's just exhausting keeping up with the guy. In any event, part of the reason to draw back from the immediate subject in front of us or person is I'm starting to think that some of the old ancient or classical accounts of time might be correct. In other words, that the human story is circular rather than linear, or progressive is the modern word we like to use, or to use a colloquial expression, everything old is new again. That's true in a lot of areas. Childhood diseases like measles and mumps that we thought were extinct are back. Large men's beards that you thought died out with 19th century presidents and Civil War generals are back with hipsters and baseball players. Socialism, as everyone knows, is back in a big way, having been declared dead and gone 25 years ago or more. And then, of course, populism and nationalism are back, and they're thought to be two closely related concepts. And, not just the United States, but a lot of countries in Europe and elsewhere are, the leading democracies, in other words, are thought to be in the throes of a populist revolt against the elites, however we understand the elites. And this has been a cause of alarm across the political spectrum. Because populism and nationalism, especially nationalism, are held to be in a bad odor. We'll talk about that a little bit. And this represents a turnabout in one way on the surface, because populism has always been thought to be, or historically, something that's usually a species of the left. I mean, the original populist movement of the 1890s was fairly left in its orientation, although it wasn't especially ideological. And conservatives have always been thought of as elitists, or at least defenders of elitism. One of the most frequent criticisms made of William F. Buckley during his career is that he was an elitist. And he often copped a guilty plea to that charge, once saying, for example, that when he contemplated going to the hospital for heart or brain surgery, he certainly preferred to have an elitist doctor. But then there was also an anti-elite or populist strain at work in Buckley as well, especially in that famous phrase I'm sure most of you or all of you have heard at one point or another, that he'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone directory than by the faculty of Harvard University. Notable to occur to me when I was putting together my notes that he didn't say the faculty of Yale University. That might have been a little bit of alumni loyalty at work. Who knows? But it may be regarded as an early indicator of the Trump phenomenon that when Buckley ran for mayor of New York in 1967, remember that was, if you don't know the story, a self-consciously symbolic or quixotic campaign. He did not expect to win, and in fact famously said if he did win, he would demand a recount. But the premise of the campaign, strategically you might say, was that he would draw what support he might get from the urbane of the Upper East Side. And he and his campaign were startled to find that he was most popular in the outer boroughs, in the working class neighborhoods of Queens and Staten Island, who, for whatever reason, didn't care much for the elites of Manhattan. And this came as something of a surprise to Buckley and his supporters. So Trump and the Brexit vote are the two most prominent examples people have in mind right now of populism in action. But I think this, as I say, rejection of the political class, to use a slightly more neutral term than elites, is at work in nearly every Western democracy to one degree or another. And it's not strictly comprehensible in the right versus left axis where things usually fall out. A good example right now is the so-called yellow vest protests in France, which began supposedly, if you can believe the news media reports, as a protest against higher fuel taxes, but has somehow broadened out into a full spectrum of left and right and everything else. Still going, by the way, still riots and fires being set and property destroyed now, I think, for 3 months. And the American media is not much covering this. And so we're thinking of it. It's still going on. And last I checked, Emmanuel Macron, who I thought was an interesting figure and perhaps promising when he was elected, but his popularity ratings are, I think, below 20%. Which shows that he does not have much support going still for him in France. And then in Italy, and I don't really know that much about Italian politics, but from what I can gather from the English language coverage is you have a very confusing scene where left and right populists are trying to govern together in coalition, no more effectively, it seems, than the old Italian ineffective governments that last 5 months. So we'll see about that. The waters are roiled is the point. So setting out, both populism and nationalism have fuzzy definitions. What exactly is populism, and how is populism distinguished from the legitimate democratic voice of the people? Expressing itself at the ballot box, withholding or granting consent, as is set out as the cornerstone of democratic theory. And what exactly is nationalism? And does a self-conscious recognition of what you might call a national character differ from patriotism? So we'll see if we can't decode a little of this. I like to half joke that populism happens when the wrong person wins an election, or the wrong cause in the case of Brexit, right? Especially in the case of Brexit. The party establishment, the business establishment, the media were uniformly against the Brexit referendum, and yet it won anyway. My proposition for tonight, or my field theory you might say, is simple, though I think it somehow eludes notice. The popular discontent of our time that we're calling populism is rooted in the contradiction of modern progressive democratic theory. Easy to say, a little harder to understand just what that means. So I'll go through it this way. If you're here last time, today's talk builds a little bit on my analysis of progressivism, but if you weren't here, it's not necessary. Or if you've forgotten, it's also not necessary to recall it closely. But one way to set out is this. The standard account of American history is that the progressive era lasted from 1900 to 1920. And even though, as I did talk about last time, American historiography has gotten less clear on this, that's less important because my bold proposition is that the progressive era never ended. We've been living in it ever since. And it's not just an American phenomenon, although there's peculiar American characteristics, of course. Many aspects of progressive ideology, which was actually inspired by a lot of European thought, especially people like Max Weber in particular, also describe or characterize a lot of governing structures in other democracies as well as ours. And the problem is that having lived in this era for more than a century now, a lot of the contradictions have been accumulating until it has reached a breaking point. I think that's what's happening. And the contradiction is this. Progressivism in theory and in practice seeks to expand popular participation in government. On the one hand, the American progressive movement, after all, grew out of the populist movement of the 1890s, in a number of ways. But a lot of those democratizing aspects of progressive reform you all know pretty well. The initiative and referendum process, which we don't have in every state, but have in a lot of them, like my home state of California, where Hiram Johnson, the legendary progressive governor, brings in that process as a way to break the power of special interests, meaning the railroads and the banks, mostly. But then direct election of senators comes in during those years. Recall, popular recall, right? Women's suffrage at long last, right? That had been a long cause that reached fruition in the progressive era. And there are a lot of other reforms that not recalled as well, but I think are significant, like open meeting laws, which today are a matter of some interest to me for obscure reasons I won't go into. The point is, make American institutions more democratic, more popular. But at the same time, on the other hand, both in theory and in practice, progressivism, going on the idea of scientific politics, said we ought to have more and more functions of government entrusted to the expert elites and done in institutional settings that are insulated from the popular pressure of ordinary partisan politics. You want administrative government that's above and beyond the reach of popular opinion on purpose. And there's a term for this kind of government that's been around in political science formally for 75 years now, but it's only recently broken out into a more wider political discourse of our time. And that term is, you may have heard it, it sounds like something translated from German, but the term we use is the administrative state. The first treatise on the administrative state dates back to the 1940s, I think by someone here at Yale, Dwight Waldo. I think he was here at Yale, who wrote the first book on it. Now, it's worth capturing for a moment. So in other words, to summarize it again, we want government more popular and less popular at the same time. That's going to create some tensions. I think it's worth, before going into the problems it has caused, recapturing a little bit of the flavor, because it's hard now at a centuries removed to appreciate how, well, not radical exactly, but how peculiar this particular understanding of how we should be governed works. One example I like to give is from a prominent political scientist, then prominent, forgotten figure named Frank Goodnow. He was one of Woodrow Wilson's teachers at Johns Hopkins. And he described this new scientific view of how we would be governed as follows. This is a long paragraph, but I think it's very illustrative. So I'll quote Frank Goodnow here. The fact is then that there is a large part of administration which is unconnected with politics, which should therefore be relieved very largely, if not altogether, from the control of political bodies. By that he means by control of Congress or legislatures. It is unconnected with politics because it embraces fields of semi-scientific, quasi-judicial, and quasi-business or commercial activity, work which has little, if any, influence on the expression of true state will. For the most advantageous discharge of this branch of the function of administration, there should be organized a force of government agents absolutely free from the influence of politics. Such a force should be free from the influence of politics because of the fact that their mission is the exercise of foresight and discretion, the pursuit of truth, the gathering of information, the maintenance of a strictly impartial attitude toward the individuals with whom they have dealings, and the provision of the most efficient possible administrative organization. And this last two sentences are the ones that really get me. The position assigned to such officers should be the same as that which has been by universal consent assigned to judges. Their work is no more political in character than is that of judges. Oh, yeah, we got some back talk. So, I mean, one of the things you know is that although judging and law is a serious matter, and we try for consistency, and there is some, on the other hand, even judicial work can't escape political controversy. I mean, the premise of that long paragraph is there's large areas of government today that should not be controversial, that should be beyond partisan or ideological division. And there's something almost charming or almost comic about that level of naivete, I think. And yet a lot of people still believe it to one degree or another, both here and abroad. Now, as I say, you can't have a government that's both more popular and less popular at the same time and not have tensions that become unsustainable. And so I think there are three problems with the administrative state. I'll list them and then we'll break them down. The first is a constitutional problem. The second is the problem of basic competence. Can an administrative orientation of government deliver the goods? Can it deliver the superior performance the progressives promised us? And third, and most importantly, there's a social dimension to the administrative state, I think perhaps first explored in detail by James Burnham in the Managerial Revolution. I'll come to that in a bit. And it's this last part that's probably the most important. So I'm going to go through the first two rather quickly, I think. I said first, the administrative state has a constitutional problem for the simple reason that it faces the separation of powers that's at the core of our constitutional order. And even though I think parliamentary governments have less formal separation of powers than we do, that same principle still works. After all, remember, we got the idea of the separation of powers most explicitly from Montesquieu, Frenchman, right? And when you erode the separation of powers, you tend to centralize power in Washington, and thereby, especially in the American scheme, you erode federalism. And so today, the most, I put it this way, I think an awful lot of the effective government of the country today is done by administrative agencies that first write the law. They call them regulations, but regulation is just a long word for law. They enforce the law, and then they judge disputes themselves internally. You know, Madison said, I think it's Federalist 43 or 47, I forget which one, that the combination of the three powers of government in one hands, or one group of people, or one agency, legislative, executive, and judicial, is the very definition of tyranny. And yet that's what we do today. Now, a lot of this has come about, didn't happen all at once, a lot of this has come about from excess delegation of power from Congress to the executive branch. And a lot of it has also come about by a century's worth of changes in our jurisprudence, mostly through the Supreme Court. And both of those aspects are complicated and take a while to get through, and so I'm going to skip over them today. But I'll mention one example that is right in front of us right now. So just this afternoon, the House tried to override President Trump's veto of his declaration of a national emergency to build this wall. And he declared the national emergency under the National Emergencies Act of 1976, so that's not that long ago. Presidents have used that 39 times between then and now for various things. Obama used it for our actions in Libya in whatever year that was, 2011, 2013, I forget. And that act was very broad. It says the president may declare a national emergency, and under such a declaration, the president can move money around and do all kinds of things, even though the Constitution says what? Congress has the power of the purse. In this case, President Trump, having not gotten what he wanted in funding from Congress, says, well, I'm just going to use this National Emergencies Act. So that was probably, I think, my opinion, a lot of people think this, an improvident grant of power from Congress to the president, and getting it back is hard because the president has vetoed the resolution. I did notice, though, that rather than Congress saying the way Madison hoped they would in Federalist 51, that ambition would make the different branches guard their powers jealously, I would have thought that people in Congress might have said, you know, maybe we ought to rewrite that act and narrow it, define national emergencies more precisely, put some limits. It could be like the War Powers Act, which is a problematic law in some ways, but never mind that for now, that says a national declaration of emergency must be ratified by Congress within 90 days, or something like that could be done. Instead, the junior senator of this state, Chris Murphy, said, well, just wait till we get back in power in the White House. We'll use it to do climate change and ban guns. And the point is that no thought of actually Congress reclaiming its power it improvidently gave to the president. There's lots of examples like that. There's other aspects of this I can go on about, but there's one description I want to use now because that's such a good one. It's from a fellow at Boston University School of Law named Gary Lawson, who wrote a terrific article that still gets widely cited more than 20 years ago now in the Harvard Law Review, called The Rise and the Rise of the Administrative State. And I think the Harvard Law Review printed it, as I'm sure very few people there at Harvard Law agree with him, but he was so provocative in the article. So for example, I think the first paragraph he says this: the modern administrative state is not merely unconstitutional, it is anti-constitutional. The Constitution was designed specifically to prevent the emergence of the kind of institutions that characterize the modern administrative state. And he gave this one paragraph description of how it works in practice that I think is brilliant and does what I could take 2 or 3 hours to explain in boring detail. So I'll read it to you here because it gets more fun and almost amusing, I think, by the end. So, quote from Gary Lawson. Consider the typical enforcement activities of a typical federal agency. For example, the Federal Trade Commission. The Commission promulgates substantive rules of conduct. The Commission then considers whether to authorize investigations into whether the Commission's rules have been violated. If the Commission authorizes an investigation, the investigation is conducted by the Commission, which reports its findings to the Commission. They're legislating, reporting themselves, right? If the Commission thinks that the Commission's findings warrant an enforcement action, the Commission issues a complaint. The Commission's complaint that a Commission's rule has been violated is then prosecuted by the Commission and adjudicated by the Commission. This starts to get to be a chorus. You can almost sing along with me, right? The Commission adjudication can either take place before the full Commission or before a semi-autonomous Commission administrative law judge. If the Commission chooses to adjudicate before an administrative law judge rather than before the Commission, and the decision is adverse to the Commission can appeal to the Commission. If the Commission ultimately finds a violation, then and only then the effective private party can appeal to an Article III court. But the agency decision, even before a bona fide Article III court, possesses a very strong presumption of correctness on both matters of fact and of law. So that last sentence is now wrapped up in, if you follow these things, about disputes over the Chevron doctrine and bureaucratic deference by the courts and so forth. It's an interesting and important subject, but this is not new, is the point. And I think that's a wonderful description. Another agency I'll just mention quickly is the Securities Exchange Commission. So Lawson talked about the Federal Trade Commission, created in 1916 with, if you know the Clayton Act, it just said, you people go off and worry about unfair competition. Didn't define unfair competition. And the Federal Trade Commission's been going back and forth for a century about what they do and how to do it, with different theories every 10 or 20 years coming along. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created during the Depression, so it's another very old regulatory agency because it was thought that a lot of misbehavior on Wall Street contributed to the Great Crash and the Depression. And like other commissions, like the FTC, they have their own administrative law judges that they bring enforcement actions before. And the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago went and looked at how the Securities Exchange Commission fared with their own administrative judges that they appoint. They're not judges for life like district court or Supreme Court that we're familiar with. And how they fared when their cases were in regular Article III courts. Guess what? When the SEC did a case before their own judges, they won 90% of the time. When a case got into federal court, they only won 70% of the time. And there's been a case, it's now an appeal, these things take forever, where a federal appeals court has said, you know, we think that maybe this actually violates separation of powers. The idea of separation of powers is slowly coming back in the courts. And so the whole SEC apparatus is in some question right now. So we'll see how this goes. This is a very lively issue going on right now in jurisprudence and at law schools and so forth. The second problem I mentioned was the competence of our, here I'll just switch from administrative state to bureaucratic government, right? We're more familiar with that one. Tales of bureaucratic incompetence are the subject of just about every barroom conversation if you're short of material to talk about, right? And you can think of serious critiques that go back decades, like Friedrich Hayek's, you might say, a detailed explanation of what I call the knowledge problem or the information problem. There's critiques of the nature of bureaucratic government by public choice theory, for example. But never mind those critiques. Let's look at the record for a moment. If you just take the big things of the last 50, 60 years, you have, let's see, the Vietnam War, or I call it the twin wars of the 60s, the Vietnam War and the War on Poverty, both thought more or less to have been not very effective. In the 70s, you have inflation and stagnation and scandal with Watergate and such. Then we have the Iraq War that nobody thinks went very well 15 years ago. And then 10 years ago, the housing crisis and financial crisis that swept the globe. And those are just the highlights. You can pick lots of lesser failures of government of the last 25 or 50 years if you want. So no wonder a generation of rising young people looks at this, especially the last 10, 15 years, and says, why don't we give socialism a try? I mean, the record is one of incompetence and disaster, not just here, but in other countries. And so, since I'm a political scientist and I follow survey questions, one of the ones that's the most interesting to me and ought to alarm everybody is what the pollsters call the trust question. And we ask lots and lots of questions about trusts in various kinds of institutions, public and private. And in 1958 is when Gallup and Harris, but especially Gallup, started asking the question that goes something like this: do you have high confidence in the federal government to do the right thing all the time or most of the time, or little of the time or none of the time? In 1958, the number of people who said they had high confidence in the government all the time or most of the time was 78%. Pretty good number. Anyone want to guess what the number is today? Maybe some of you know this. Yeah, it struggles to get above 15. And I've seen the graph, I've done the data series on this. If you go from the 1950s when it starts, it's just all downhill through the 60s, through the 70s. It does go back up under Ronald Reagan for a sustained period of time, and then, back to like 45, 50% under Reagan. Things went well under him, I think, in a general way. And then it's been all downhill again ever since. Little blips now and then, like the Iraq War, we rallied around the president, okay, but it doesn't last very long. Now, there's a lot of explanations for this. It turns out that public trust in a lot of institutions has gone down. The Catholic Church, so there are scandals. Banks aren't popular. The military holds up very well because they're pretty good at their basic jobs, which is killing people and breaking things, right? But a lot of but nobody fares as bad as the government. Even the institutions like the church still are somewhere in the 40s and 50s. The military is still like 60, 70% high confidence ratings. Other banks do very badly because none of us like bankers, right? Media, I'd love to see the polls on the media this week. But I think it's too bad this series doesn't go back earlier. I would love to have had numbers. We didn't really have scientific polling to the late 30s. I'd love to have numbers going back a century. So if you're a citizen in 1958 and you're looking out at your government, especially the federal government, what do you have in front of you? We got a government that a decade before managed to win the largest war in human history in under 4 years. And then educate a generation of people with the explosion of colleges and universities with the GI Bill. You had a pretty good economy that worked really well for everybody. Now, that may have been an anomaly of the time. That's a longer, separate story for a different time. And then, we built the interstate highway starting in the 50s. Things worked. My home state of I wasn't born yet, but my home state of California builds hundreds of miles of water projects to have agriculture flourish. We build schools and universities like crazy. We built stuff. The government looks like it's pretty competent, gets a lot of good stuff done. And in the years since then, you have this litany, as I say, of incompetence, but also overpromising. You really start to see, much more so than ever before, a rhetoric of extravagance. My favorite moment is when the war on poverty gets going in 1964 to 66. And the person who headed it for President Johnson, Sergeant Shriver, went before Congress and said, we're confident we're going to eliminate poverty completely in 10 years. Well, that was 1966, and here it's 2019, right? I think this over-promising and under-delivery is not lost on people. And this came up when actually gets on the populism question a little bit. I will just go off script here a little bit. One of the things that Trump does well that nobody appreciates is think about the coal miners. He talked about our coal miners. He's just talking to more collective, it's all as a we. We're all of us in there together. And that really was very distinct from the way Hillary Clinton talked about it. What did she do? She went and said, we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of work and close a lot of coal mines. And, the whole global warming business. Now, to be fair, the media didn't report the second half of that, and that was not fair to her, because she went on to say, and then we're going to have my administration is going to do this for you. We're going to have job training programs and invest in new technologies to revitalize these communities in places that now depend on coal. Okay, good for her, except I don't think people believe that anymore, because we've been hearing it for 60 years. I mean, you might have thought that was a credible promise from your national government in 1965 when Lyndon Johnson set up the Appalachian Regional Commission, which still exists. They still have offices in New York and elsewhere. When's the last time you read in the paper about some great accomplishment of the Appalachian Regional Commission, right? So I think this is not lost on people, and I think this is something that I don't really want to pick on Hillary Clinton too much or especially, but I think that's emblematic of this credibility problem that government has today. And so, to be fair, on the other side of the ledger, yeah, Trump is pro-coal, but market forces are determining what's going on there. Natural gas is displacing coal. That's going to keep going on. There's been some revival, and that has to do with trade and some other things. But the point is what did people hear? Trump said, our coal miners, right? That language should not be discounted. Now, some of these problems have actually been known for a long time by an older generation of people. I'm going to use him because one of my favorites and nobody else does, and it's Calvin Coolidge. He gave a speech that most people don't know about when he was vice president in 1922 to the American Bar Association. And, he was a critic of what we now call the administrative state or progressive ideas in government, even though in many ways, he was very progressive himself. He supported minimum wage. As a governor of Massachusetts, he supported a lot of progressive reforms as a practical matter. But he understood that there was an extravagance to the theory that wasn't going to work. So one of the things he said was this. Under this weight of ever larger government, the former accuracy of administration breaks down. The government has not at its disposal a supply of ability, honesty, and character necessary for the solution of all these problems, or an executive capacity great enough for their perfect administration. Nor is it in possession of a wisdom which enables it to take in great enterprises and manage them with no ground of criticism. You'd almost think he was replying to Frank Goodnow in this passage. We cannot rid ourselves of the human element in our affairs by an act of legislation which places them under a jurisdiction of a public commission. Its attempt must be accompanied with a full expectation of very many failures. He was a realist. He said a lot more in that speech, but I want to turn to another figure that maybe be a little more surprising, and that's Max Weber, the great German sociologist and philosopher, who was one of the early, you might say, architects of bureaucratic government. Not because he necessarily liked it, in fact, quite the contrary, but because he thought there was no alternative to modern industrial society than to have bureaucratic organization of government. And he ticked off the reasons why they're sensible. But he also said, essentially, that it was really going to have, I sometimes go too far and say, he really thought it was going to suck, to use modern language. But that's kind of what he said. Now, Max Weber, I still like reading Weber. He's still read a lot. The problem with Weber is he can be dull and tedious, but I think when you get through that, he's deeply interesting and insightful. If you're not familiar with Weber, he was a critic of capitalism and a sympathizer of socialism, but had the intellectual honesty to understand that socialism was unlikely to work in practice. It wouldn't lead to the liberation of workers. In fact, it was going to lead to the empowerment of bureaucrats. In fact, one of his phrases was, we are trending toward inescapable universal bureaucratization. And what he thought was this would undermine individualism, it would undermine entrepreneurship, and he understood well before people came along with public choice theory 70 years later that bureaucrats would become single-minded in their behavior. Their specialized knowledge would lead to a narrowing of horizons. It's not unusual to talk to a bureaucrat and you'll say, you know, this regulation will have this effect on something else. And I'll say, well, that's not my responsibility. That's the responsibility of some other agency. Well, those are the kinds of trade-offs that political leaders are supposed to think about. But if you have this idea that administration is disconnected from politics, you stop thinking that way. And so Weber had some of his most colorful language. This otherwise dull guy could occasionally have some really colorful and I think, profound language. He said, bureaucracy would lead to, in one translation, mechanized petrifaction. And that our bureaucrats would become, I'll quote him here, specialists without spirit or vision and voluptuaries without heart. And if you think of the long sweep of history of European democracy and progress was escaping from feudalism, having individual liberty and popular government, this new form of government, he said the following: everywhere the steel housing for the new bondage stands ready. All right? So let's now descend from the epic failures I've mentioned, like the Vietnam War, so forth, war and poverty, and just look at the style of government we get. And here we can have some fun. I don't know if you follow this, but one of the European Union regulations, proposed regulations, that got a lot of discussion during the Brexit debate was a regulation that came out of European Union headquarters in Brussels regarding the size and curvature of bananas to be sold in stores, as though consumers weren't able to make up their own mind whether a banana had too much curve in it or wasn't long enough, right? And of course, it was withdrawn under heavy ridicule. But the question is, what kind of person would think this was a suitable thing to regulate in the first place? Someone with too much time on their hands? Why is there nobody in the room saying, that's a really dumb idea, why are we doing that? But there are a lot of similar examples in this country. I'll tell you one that's of special importance to me, personally. Did you know that magicians, even amateur magicians who just do magic shows for kids' birthday parties, are subject to federal regulation? I take this personally because when I was in high school, I studied magic. I got really good at rope tricks and card tricks and some simple illusions. I never did a rabbit out of a hat because I didn't want to keep a rabbit. But guess what? It paid a lot better than mowing lawns. So anyway, when I read this story a few years ago, I took some personal characteristics for me. So, there are a bunch of regulations on people who keep animals, like research laboratories, circuses, zoos. In other words, the statute originally was anyone who is an exhibitor of an animal. So they mean Barnum and Bailey, right? Or a zoo, or I'm sure there are a lot of animals in the research labs here at Yale and elsewhere. But back in 2005, that's when the story started. An inspector from the Department of Agriculture's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service happened to catch a magic show for a bunch of little kids in Monette, Missouri, where the musician, a guy named Marty Haney, pulled a rabbit, his rabbit was called Casey, out of a hat. And so first, the USDA official asked after the show to see Mr. Haney's license, which he didn't know he needed. So he went and got one. They're cheap. And then they contacted Mr. Haney with a letter. The letter begins this way: "Dear members of our regulated community." That's a frequent term of art that's used. And they wanted to know what his disaster plan for his rabbit was. And he's like, what? So what he did, with the help of a disaster plan consultant, that's the other thing about the way the administrative state works, it makes a lot of private sector work for consultants to help you navigate through this maw. He did a 34-page plan to answer how he would safeguard his rabbit Casey against chemical leaks, floods, tornadoes, heat waves, and other emergencies. Specify the evacuation procedures that he would use, and even the contingencies if he and his wife were disabled. How would the rabbit be cared for? So the interesting here, if you just have a pet rabbit, government can't reach you. But if you actually take that rabbit and for $50 do a kid's birthday party, you're now subject to federal regulation. So this rule was withdrawn when the Washington Post got wind of it and wrote it up. So it's one of the things. Rules like this, if they're ever exposed, they can't survive public scrutiny. But there's lots of them that just go on and maybe have a somewhat more plausible basis than this that you don't ever hear about. Would Congress approve a federal license and regulatory regime for amateur magicians and rabbits? I think it's doubtful. And yet we get things like this, and bigger things. So, another big one that I won't say much about, but Congress unable to pass any meaningful climate legislation prompts President Obama to say, we'll just use the Clean Air Act, even though the proposal that he put forth has since been withdrawn and under challenge in the courts, would never have passed Congress if it came to a vote. But who needs Congress when you can just use some old act and some language and twist it around? If you're a dentist, any dentist here, the occupational safety and health regulations for your office are 183 pages long. And by the way, a further final point on this before pressing ahead is it's not just the federal government or even just state governments. What I call the culture of bureaucracy, and that's the third point I'll turn to in a minute, it goes all the way down. And so something I started tracking a few years ago, because I saw a few news stories, and I started looking around to find more, and I got to about 40, concerned local governments that had shut down little kids' lemonade stands in various parts of the country. And didn't have a business license, didn't have a health inspection where you made the lemonade in your mom's kitchen or dad's kitchen, whatever. And at first I thought, well, all right, if a kid has a lemonade stand out in the median of a busy boulevard and didn't think about it, that's a bad idea, and you better move. It's for a safety reason, but it didn't seem to be any of that. And 40 is not very many in as big a country as this, but the number in any rightly ordered country should be 0. I mean, this is preposterous, but you see the culture of that goes all the way down. Turns out, I'm an older guy now, but my school, and it used to be fairly common to have bake sales to raise money for, school group and whatever, and almost impossible to do anymore because of regulations and liability and various other things, but especially regulations. And so schools have had a lot of places have had to give up on bake sales, and that's crazy. And that leads me to the third part. As I say, this is a culture that's now gone all the way down to all levels of government. And so one way to think about this is if you look at the old cop shows, I'm not sure how authentic they were, but I think they're authentic to this extent. The police used to be, and there were problems with this, but they used to be very much a working class occupation. And now it's been professionalized. You go to the police academy and so forth, lots of training. But police talk different. Police behavior's changed a lot. Much of it probably for the better, but police talk now like bureaucrats. So, the old Sergeant Murphy, the old cliche who used to walk the beat, now they're in a car, they have their computers, and when they get in court, they talk like bureaucrats in how they describe their procedures and what happened in the crime. They don't talk like normal human beings anymore. And that may not be the worst thing in the world, but it's part of this larger change of the culture of the way people in our governments work. And that's what turns to the third, I think, most important part of this whole scene, what I call the cultural or social dimension of, and this connects to the whole populism question. I mentioned at the outset James Burnham's famous book, The Managerial Revolution, James Burnham being a subject of one of the early Buckley program conferences here several years ago, my first exposure to Lauren and the gang. And that book, I think it's still in print, but it's easy to find, is very much worth reading today. And the Managerial Revolution really picked up on where what I've been calling the progressive revolution in our administrative ideas was heading. And what Burnham perceived, having been a communist for a long time, a very interesting man, what he perceived is that the rise of what he called the managerial elite, he doesn't mean like managers of companies, but this idea of expertise, it was going to transform both public and private sectors. It was going to transform everything, and it was going to make the old class struggle quarrel between capital and labor, or between capitalism and socialism, obsolete. And he said, well, I'm the first to say that the struggle of the 20th century, I think beyond, was not between economic classes so much as it would be between the knowledge class and everyone else. So he thought the real ruling class was not going to be the owners of the means of production, not even the owners of the stock in major corporations, but it would be the people who control the state and a lot of the sort of associate institutions, cultural, media, entertainment, and so forth. later thinkers came along and called this the new class rather than the managerial class. That was Irving Kristol's phrase, the new class. Lionel Trilling, the famous literary critic, called it later the adversarial class, and that's what brings us a little closer to the dynamic of today, is that this class has different interests and outlooks than the people that it rules over. Now, it wasn't that this was going to be, the old Marxist capitalist class was very much, sort of determined by dialectical materialism and all of his theories. Burnham didn't think, and his successors didn't think, that this would be a self-conscious or ideological, like conspiratorial, the way some people talk about, our global elites and so forth. They didn't think that. They just thought they'd naturally fall into having a class interest, and that even without an ideology and active deliberation, they would form an intelligible phenomenon. And I think you can see things like it today, like the World Economic Forum that gathers every year over in Davos. They do an awful lot of collaborative, if not exactly planning, at least a lot of what you might call collaborative intentionality. They're always passing resolutions about all kinds of good things they're for. I like this term someone came up with of calling the people who go to the World Economic Forum the Davoisie instead of the bourgeoisie, right? I think that's a good one. Let's see. A lot more here, but I need to skip over in the interest of time. I said that Burnham's managerial elite, or the new class, or the adversarial class, whatever you want to call it, I said they wouldn't have an ideology, but they did have a practice that I think maybe is best summed up in that term that Eric Voegelin liked to use of Gnosticism. Gnosticism means secret knowledge, right? Secret practices. And lo and behold, once again, Max Weber was onto this over 100 years ago. Give you one of his descriptions from the late 19th century about how he expected bureaucratic behavior would play out in practice. So, quote from Weber, "Every bureaucracy seeks to increase the superiority of the professionally informed by keeping their knowledge and intentions secret. Bureaucratic administration always tends to be an administration of secret sessions. Insofar as it can, it hides its knowledge and action from criticism. In facing a parliament, the bureaucracy, out of a sure power instinct, fights every attempt of the parliament to gain knowledge by means of its own experts or from interest groups. Bureaucracy naturally welcomes a poorly informed and hence a powerless parliament, at least insofar as ignorance somehow agrees with the bureaucracy's interests." I find it an astonishingly accurate passage to describe things that I used to follow in my days as a policy wonk in Washington about the way the scientific advisory boards at the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, always seem to come up with exactly the answers that the regulators wanted for a regulation they wanted to do, and were impervious to contrary evidence from equally qualified experts outside. And this is, there's a controversy because Trump and his people want to shake this up, and the usual interest groups are objecting. It's a long story. We can unpack that at great length, of course, right? And it is an interesting thing that Woodrow Wilson and other progressives openly admired Bismarck and Bismarck's administrative innovations in Germany, from which Weber was observing firsthand and taking some of his bearings. But Wilson and others had none of the clarity and second thoughts or perceptions about the downside that Weber had. By the way, Weber had some doubts, as I say, doubts about bureaucratic rule that are especially interesting when he talked about the United States, because he visited the United States in the, I think, late 1880s or 1890s. And he talked about, gosh, America has lots of corruption, lots of inefficiencies, a lot of waste, and only a country that's so bountiful in resources could tolerate such an inefficient and profligate government. But then he had this description of talking to some workers in Chicago. You quote him here. "Scarcely 15 years ago, when American workers were asked," he's the person who did the asking, he tells us in the third person, but scarcely 15 years ago, when American workers were asked why they allowed themselves to be governed by politicians whom they admitted they despised, the answer was, quote, "We prefer having people in office whom we can spit upon, rather than a caste of officials who spit on us, as is the case with you." saying back to Weber and the Germans who were there with him. And Weber ends that paragraph. This was the old point of view of American democracy. He wrote this in 1918. This is part of his Politics as Vocation lecture, if you know it. Interesting lecture. But that comment, sourced all the way back to 1895 or something, that's the voice of the Trump voter, or the Brexit voter, or the French yellow vest protesters, or the plurality, if not a majority, of Italians who are fed up with things, or a lot of the people voting for these various coalitions in Eastern Europe that have various characters that we can't quite pin down. The point is, to use some language oddly stolen from the 60s, is that the sort of elite culture of the managerial class has spawned a counterculture that we call populism. And it is reacting to, and a lot of people have said this is not original with me, they're reacting to what really looks like snobbery. I mean, literally snobbery at work, in Hollywood, in the media, in government. And now we come full circle to where I talked in the beginning about things run in cycles rather than in a linear fashion. And here's the last portion of my talk, and then we'll do questions and comments. So back in the 1920s, the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset wrote a best-selling book you may have heard of and some of you may have read called Revolt of the Masses. It was late 20s this book came out. Now, Ortega was sort of an old-fashioned conservative aristocrat of the European style. He didn't like all these innovations of modern democracy, and he had that, he wrote very elegantly, interesting guy, but really when you strip it down, he was one of those old-fashioned European conservatives who thought, oh my goodness, we're empowering the masses, it's going to be terrible for all the benevolent noblesse oblige aristocrats who've run Europe and the royal families have run Europe for hundreds of years. This is terrible, right? But I think exactly the opposite is what's happened. One of the most interesting books of the last generation, which I highly recommend if you've never read it or heard of it, was from 1995, so a while ago now, by Christopher Lasch, called The Revolt of the Elites. And he actually wrote it saying, Ortega had it wrong. It was not the masses who would revolt. It was going to be the elites revolting against the masses. And what makes this especially interesting is that Lasch, who died actually in 1994, the book was published a few months after he died, is that he was a person of the moderate left, I think you'd say, a curious figure. He had a lot of sympathy with the student new left of the 1960s, especially the anti-Vietnam War movement, but he sympathized more broadly with some of the other new left complaints about what they called the system back in the 60s. And in the 1970s, his book, The Culture of Narcissism, in 1978, was said to be one of Jimmy Carter's favorite books and helped inspire Carter's really dreadful crisis of confidence speech from 1979. So the point is, Lasch considered himself something of a person of the left, not the radical left, but somewhere left of center. I mean, he was for higher taxes and redistribution and all those sort of usual things that social democrats would be for. But his book reads like something, well, in fact, Steve Bannon was a fan of this book, which ought to make everybody's heads explode. And he said, yeah, the elites are going to revolt against the masses, and you're going to have this, like Burnham said. I don't think he read Burnham. I didn't see that in his wide bibliography that Lasch had in his book. But I'm going to give you just a couple paragraphs. There's large passages I'd love to read aloud to you, but I'm just going to give you two because I want to restrain myself. So here's the first one. The culture wars that have convulsed America since the 60s are best understood as a form of class warfare in which an enlightened elite, as it thinks of itself at least, seeks not so much to impose its values on the majority, a majority it perceives as incorrigibly racist, sexist, provincial, and xenophobic, much less to persuade the majority by means of rational public debate, as to create a parallel or alternative institutions in which it will no longer be necessary to confront the unenlightened at all. A lot of the language today, you'll hear it about, flyover country. But I mean, I mentioned this one of the last times I was here is, Bill Maher, the comedian, talked about, well, out here on the course, we have fancy chefs like Wolfgang Puck, and the people live they have Chef Boyardee. That's pure snobbery at work, but that really is emblematic of the way the kind of people Lasch is talking about think. And they don't really care if they don't think of them as our coal miners, right? even if they may be different. They have contempt. And, the voters now have, enough of them, contempt in return. This is not good. I said I had two, I have three. Here's the next one. Simultaneously arrogant and insecure. The new elites, the professional classes in particular, regard the masses with mingled scorn and apprehension. This is 1995, a while ago now, right? In the United States, middle America, a term that has both geographical and social implications, has come to symbolize everything that stands in the way of progress. Family values, mindless patriotism, religious fundamentalism, racism, homophobia, retrograde views of women. Middle Americans, as they appear to the makers of educated opinion, are hopelessly shabby, unfashionable and provincial, ill-informed about changes in taste or intellectual trends, addicted to trashy novels or romance and adventures, and stupefied by prolonged exposure to television. That part might be true, I don't know. They are at once absurd and vaguely menacing, not because they wish to overthrow the old order, but because their defense of it appears so deeply irrational that it expresses itself at the higher reaches of its intensity in fanatical religiosity, in repressive sexuality that occasionally erupts into violence against women and gays, and in a patriotism that supports imperialist wars and a national ethic of aggressive masculinity. If he was still alive, he would update that and change it to toxic masculinity, of course. That's the term we use today, right? Finally, he had a good thing to say about populism in my last selection from Christopher Lasch. Populism, as I understand it, is unambiguously committed to the principle of respect. This is, you can see now why Steve Bannon liked this book, right? Even a person who's author from, as I say, from the left. Populism has always rejected both the politics of deference and the politics of pity. It stands for plain manners and plain, straightforward speech. Populism is the authentic voice of democracy. Populism is judgmental, he puts that in quotes, to invoke a current adjective, the pejorative use of which shows how far the capacity for discriminating judgment has been weakened by the moral climate of humanitarian concern. As I say, there's a lot more from all of that. I'm going to give you one last quote to close out. I'll tell you who said it at the end and when. From an American now. Well, Lasch is American. I don't know why I said that. Quote, "What is going on is something very strange and without precedent. To put it simply, the common sense, not the passion, but the common sense of the American people has been outraged over the past 20 years by the persistent unwisdom of their elected and appointed officials. To the degree that we are witnessing a crisis in our democratic institutions, it is a crisis of our disoriented elites, not of a blindly impassioned populace. This new populism is no kind of blind rebellion against good constitutional government. It is rather an effort to bring our governing elites to their senses. That is why so many people, and I include myself among them, who would ordinarily worry about a populist upsurge find themselves so sympathetic to this new populism." Those words were written in 1985, even longer ago than Christopher Lasch, and they were written by Irving Kristol. So when Bill's here tomorrow, in fact, I'm going to leave you with this. You put it in front of him and say, "So, Bill." And thank you very much. I'll take questions and comments now. I've gone on quite a long time.
I was going to ask the first question. I hope that's all right. I was going to ask, do you see any, yeah, absolutely, any inherent differences between populism on the left and populism on the right?
Yes, good question. Among the many, I didn't really talk about nationalism. I ran out of time in putting this together, and so we can do some of that now. So I think nationalism is one of them. A lot of the populism now here and elsewhere has a nationalist component to it. Now, the problem is that word has so much baggage. You say nationalist, and people say, you mean blood and soil racism, and I don't, that does exist. Let me do a thought experiment this way. Those of you who know either you're old enough or remember this or read history books, the America First Committee in 1940 had a lot of really unsavory people in it and a lot of explicit anti-Semitism. As a thought experiment, strip that part out. Suppose that didn't happen, there wasn't any part of it at all. And instead, what their argument was, which was part of their argument was, is look, our intervention in World War I was a bad idea. We actually made things worse in some ways. They would have settled things better. I think this is all true, by the way. And why are we thinking of doing this again? A perfectly reasonable argument, even if also maybe incorrect in certain other ways. But it's because of that, it gave aid and comfort to the anti-Semitism and therefore supposedly delayed us in preparing. Okay. An awful lot of nationalism is, I think, can be salvaged on the basis that it's people saying, you know, we have borders, we have a culture, we have a language, and that deserves some respect. Now, I happen to think that America is the best example of a nationalism that is, to use the current term, inclusive. And it had to be by nature of all the different, you know, people came here, all their different religions, for religious freedom, and from very early on, pluralism. We're better at that than most other countries. I could go on a long time about this, but you know, Muslim assimilation works better in this country than anywhere. Certainly France or England. Muslim households in this country have higher than the national median for income. So that's just one measure. So, you know, we're actually the best at it. Maybe a little dodgier in some of the European countries. I don't know. I don't live over there. Second point. Sorry, I'm going on too long about this. Second point is, this is an observation about what's right in front of us right now. The liberals are right. Liberals, the left, however you want to put it. They're right about one thing. It is a significant political problem, and it destabilizes our political order when the economic growth that we have and income growth is captured overwhelmingly at the upper end of the income distribution. That is fairly new in the last 15, 20, 25 years, depending on how you calculate it and so forth. Now, right now, just in the last few months, we're seeing wages rising fastest at the lowest end of the income scale, so this is good. Maybe this, you know, Trumponomics or whatever we call it works, but we'll see if that continues. So there is a great opening for left populism to say we ought to go back to high tax, the things that some of them are saying, right, like Bernie Sanders. There's a reason Bernie Sanders, as implausible he is in some ways, is working. The dilemma, I think, for Democrats is, I think that could be a successful message. However, are they going to be able to suppress the overwhelming urge for identity politics that has been driving them for such a long time? I'm doubting they can because it's so deeply ingrained in politics of the left right now. So their populism, which is the populism of the 1890s, I think that could be effective. And that, of course, differs from the populism of respect that Lash was talking about and I was talking about. So those are some of the differences. Someone else? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm wondering if you could kind of clarify what's going on with isolationism. American nationalism seems to often end up isolationist, and because it's strange. This is perhaps gliding over some differences, but the progressives adopted a lot of the populist platforms, but the progressives were the ones that were expansionist, whereas the Republicans during the period were isolationists. I was wondering if you could go into some discussion of that.
Yeah, well, that last point, Republicans remained substantially isolationist well into the 50s. I mean, it's really Eisenhower's a turning point, and that's not, I mean, I was born when Eisenhower was president, so it's not that long ago. Maybe it is. Okay. But yeah, that's an important point. So I could talk a long time about this. I think a couple of bullet points, though, quickly, is the kind of internationalism engagement the United States has had since World War II is kind of unnatural for this country. We're naturally an isolationist country, partly from geography. And the Cold War is something of an anomaly because you have an existential threat, not just the world order, but to us directly, right? Once that went away, now almost 30 years ago, I think it was always inevitable that we were going to, by degrees, draw back a bit. And I don't think we've drawn back that much. I mean, we still spend how many bases have we got around the world and spend a lot of money on it, and it's harder to defend that level of engagement. And so, by the way, the left has always been attacking it, right? And so I have to say, I was amused here 2-3 months ago, whatever it was, when Trump said, I'm going to pull our troops out of Syria. And you had left-wingers like, what's his name, the linguist, Chomsky. No, this is terrible. really? We finally found a military intervention that Chomsky supports. I was astounded by it. So it's, again, Trump just scrambles everything in ways that are interesting and ultimately helpful. So no, I mean, it took a long time for this. I mean, even Wilson, we draw back right away from Wilson, and lots of ways you can criticize Wilson and Wilsonian idealism that came out of all that. It's taken us a long time, and I think you want to connect that with some of the trade arguments going on right now. And so I don't know. I don't think we're done with this adjustment, whatever comes after Trump. We'll have to sort of see. I mean, like I say, I've gone a long time. Let's say one thing is, Libya became a mess after we decided we wanted to bomb Gaddafi out of office. And then Syria happens, and, we had this big debate when Obama's still president. Should we intervene? No, because, we did that a few years ago, didn't like it. Well, what about a no-fly zone? We can do that. We've got great capabilities in air power. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. And, what's happened is pretty awful. And so what I say to people who want to disengage is, left and right, it doesn't matter what your ideology says, okay, I understand the Come Home America, that was George McGovern's slogan in 1970, Come Home America, we got to stop doing all this, being the world's policeman and so forth. Said, yeah, I understand all that, but understand that the world's likely to see a lot more serious when that happens, because we do undergird the world order badly, but who else is going to do it? You want China to do it? I don't know. I don't think so. But so, you got to understand what the trade-offs involved there. And if you have more Syrias in the world, you lose the right to say, oh, isn't this terrible, if you say the United States shouldn't be involved in it. And we did end up putting some people in Syria, right? This is part of, not a lot of people, but okay. That's a big subject. I don't know where that's going. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you for your comments. How would you personally weigh in about the divisiveness about the current parties and
but the current which?
The current part between the two parties,
Oh.
the Democrats and the Republicans, during the Trump administration versus the Obama administration versus the Clinton administration, and kind of tracing a more recent origin in terms of that divisiveness. How would you, or is there somewhat of an objective approach or way to look at that?
In reverse order, I think there might be an objective way to look at it, but let me go to the first part and then end with that. I don't know what to do. Things just get worse and worse. I come up with little gimmicks now and then, but none of them really work. I mean, actually, there are some things that sound like gimmicks that I actually think would make a difference in Washington. What if members of the House and Senate didn't go home every weekend? What if they had to stick around in town? And now they wouldn't necessarily talk to each other more, but they would a little bit. And they wouldn't be back with their base. I mean, that's not going to happen. But that, they used to, before you had such great air travel, if you're a congressman from California or a congresswoman from Seattle and you come to Washington, you're there for several months in Congress in session. You're not going back and forth all the time, working a 3-day week and all the rest of that. The other thing is, people talk about social media and 24/7 news. I think that's a huge factor. I mean, if I were king for a day, I think I would ban Twitter immediately. And the 24-hour cable networks, I'm not sure about that. But here's something I talk to students about a lot is, just in my lifetime, I got out of college, I go to Washington in the 80s, and the way the news cycle worked was as follows. You got up in the morning, you picked up the Washington Post, you saw maybe what the Today Show was saying. There'd be a big story or a couple of them, and you're at the White House or on Capitol Hill. Well, you got all day long to figure out how you're going to respond to it in the afternoon press briefing and to think about what do you want on the evening news and what do you want tomorrow morning's headline to be. Well, the world we live in now is, CNN starts in 1980, right? And it's sort of off, I don't remember those days. It was, not like it is now. I mean, Larry King was the wildest thing they had, and that's, right? He was their big ratings guy, right? And by the way, that's still a very high-pressure thing. I mean, what's happening in the media cycle dominated the White House every day. I used to talk to the Reagan people about this, because they had bad relations with the press. It's not different from the way that Trump says the press is the enemy and so forth. In fact, just a quick story on this. When Reagan invaded Grenada in 1983 and they kept the media out, the media was outraged. How come you wouldn't let it, right? And somebody said one day, Well, it was simple why we didn't let you guys along. You don't take your enemy with you on your military missions. So this kind of language Trump uses is not brand new. What we have now is, the news cycle now is 15 minutes, right? A story breaks in the morning, you can't wait till the evening. You can't plan for 6 hours. There's tweets about it. And by the poor people who work in the White House, like I say, used to wake up, somebody be up at 5 a.m. or even earlier in the White House in those days to get the Washington Post fresh off the press. The paper would still be warm. You want to see what they were saying in the New York Times. Now you got to wake up at 3 a.m. to see what the boss has tweeted, right? Oh my God. But no, I mean, that has changed the pace of things. And I don't know if you or any, some of you look at Twitter, and it's just a cesspool, right? I mean, it's just nasty stuff. It spins out of control in 15 seconds. I'm on Twitter because I find it a useful source of information and to watch stuff. Long ago, myself, I only use it to tell jokes. I do not, somebody will say something nasty about something I've written, I do not respond. I just don't. Nope. And so that's just made the nature of our discourse so much worse now. And so even without the ideological divisions that have their own character, we're living in this new world, and I think there's no putting that genie back in the bottle, unfortunately. But I do think, you said there's an objective way to look at this, I do think you could, that last thing I was explaining the dynamic of the news cycle, I think you could quantify change, CNN has a monopoly on the 24-hour news for a long time, and then in the 90s you get Fox and MSNBC and all those little niche networks and online things and internet sites, internet news portals, the Drudge Report, right? And, I'm old enough to remember when, it was kind of neat to get Time and Newsweek every week to see how they would report on and interpret the big news of the last week, and now they barely exist, right? Who bothers to read those magazines for news? You don't read those for news anymore. I don't read them at all, really, but once in a while you'll see something linked online. And so the whole media world has changed, and that makes things worse. I wish I could do better than that, but I can't.
I'd be curious your view on a case against the SEC that I think Cato or IJ is bringing, where, as you said, a lot of the SEC cases are before their own judges, so everyone knows they're going to lose, so they almost all settle. And one of the requirements of the settlement are these gag orders.
Yeah.
And so I think Cato's bringing a case that says basically you can't deprive someone of their First Amendment rights because you control all the cards. So what's your reaction to that?
I'm not familiar with that suit. I should look it up because I know most of those guys at Cato have done these suits. I do know, I was just with Chip Miller last week, who had founded IJ. He's one of my best friends from way back. There's a whole series of cases, and all of them look pretty promising because things have gotten out of hand. I know there's the case against the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that was in Dodd-Frank. That one's not a speech case. That's a case that's saying, here's this regulatory agency that gets its money from the Federal Reserve and just asks for money and the Fed gives it to them. The Constitution says Congress appropriates money for things, right? It's like, this ought to be a slam dunk, but it's grinding its way along. There was the case about the Peekaboo case, the Pension Benefits Guarantee Corporation or whatever that was a few years ago. That was Competitive Enterprise Institute brought that case and won on separation of powers grounds. They're, like I said in my talk, change is afoot in some of these doctrines that we're having a lot of second thoughts about, and the judges are starting to say, yeah, you're probably right. And we chip away at these things narrowly is the problem. I don't know about that one. I should, but I'll look into it. They should win that, yeah. Anyone else? We got one more.
Last
here.
one.
Went on a long time, so.
First of all, a metaphor for you. Progressives in California in the early 20th century wanted to regulate the railroads. Now they can't build them.
Oh boy, is that really true?
Your three characteristics of the administrative state or issues: constitutionalism, competence, and cultural, which is nice and alliterative, implies that if those things could work, it would be okay to have an administrative state. And I'd like you to contrast that with a limited state, that even if it did work, it would not be appropriate, and contrast that with a European state where, in theory, while there may not be a monarch, the state still has power for everything. And as an example, derivative New Zealand, where the prime minister in one day can recall all automatic or assault weapons.
So, Yeah, I actually had it in my notes, and I didn't use it, that even an incompetent bureaucratic system, you could live with that well enough and just deal with it, and you know, you'd zig and zag, and we've zig and zagged in a lot of ways, if it were not for the last part, the cultural part. And I mean, there are some specific reforms. I didn't go into them because I didn't want to be too wonky. There's what they call the REINS Act has been proposed. It's passed the House several times, but not the Senate. That says that any regulation to be over $100 million in economic impact must be voted on affirmatively by both houses of Congress. That puts Congress back in the game. That's a good idea. That would make some difference. But on the other hand, and this is a challenge I sometimes make to my libertarian friends, is all right, I know all the things the Food and Drug Administration, created in 1906, one of our oldest regulatory, I know all the things they do wrong and why their procedures are kludgy and slower than the Europeans in drug approvals, incidentally, but not necessarily less safe, I don't think. But what's the alternative? The alternative surely wouldn't be having Congress vote on new drug approvals. Do you want AOC and Steve King voting on whether to approve a new cancer drug? I don't think so. I mean, even if you think you have committees that would get expert testimony and operate like a commission, you'd still have the influence of the drug companies and also the people who don't like the drug, right? I don't think that would work. So what's the alternative? It's not clear that there's a non-bureaucrat. Max Weber was right in a certain sense about this. We're going to have bureaucracies. Now, the Europeans you mentioned, and I've always wanted to get into this more deeply, but the one I know the best, of course, is the British civil service. And by the way, I've always wanted to teach an entire class on public administration that would consist of screening every episode of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. If you've never seen any of those shows, they're on YouTube, a lot of them. Watch them. It was written, by the way, by a couple of semi-libertarian public choice graduate students who then had a hit in their hands and became TV guys. So it's Margaret Thatcher's favorite show, you may know. That maybe have been the turning point, because one of the brilliant things about that show is it shows some of the things I was describing, that the self-interest of the bureaucrats and wanting to keep the elected officials ignorant and baffle them with BS, as we'd say, right? And it may be that's inexorable in modern bureaucratic government, but the British civil service always had a long tradition of being scrupulously neutral between the parties. And so you'd have these permanent secretaries and permanent staffs, and they weren't like, as we call it, the resistance or the swamp or the things you have in Washington. I think our bureaucracy was always more partisan going back to the New Deal. I mean, look, I didn't say it tonight, but look, the bureaucratic structure of American government is the partisan tool of the Democratic Party. Full stop. Nixon understood that, by the way, and would say it once in a while. And I don't know why Republicans don't say it. They complain about bureaucracy, but they don't actually try and ever attach it to the other party, which is dumb, I think. I mean, it's complicated. So I think that's changed in Britain, and I think you see it in that show. By the way, there is one of my favorite episodes is the one where Bernard Woolley asked Sir Humphrey Appleby, who's the senior not bad guy, he's really charming, but says, shouldn't we believe in what the minister wants to do? And Sir Humphrey says, oh, heavens, Bernard says, if I'd believed in what the government wanted, I'd have been a death penalty advocate and an abolitionist. I'd have been a public school privatizer and a public school choice person. I'd have been a raging Keynesian and a raving Friedmanite. But above all, I've been a stark, raving, mad schizophrenic. One of the great laugh lines in it, right? And there's something to that, though. You know, you tell me what policy you want, and the minister asked him in that same scene, says, you'll carry the policy even if it's wrong? And he says, well, most government policy is wrong, but frightfully well carried out. If you have that kind of disposition in a civil service or bureaucracy, then life goes better. But it's when they take on their class interests, as I was trying to explain and Burnham explained, that's where things start to go wrong, I think. Anyway, thank you all very much.